History proves that whenever humanity tries to bypass the laws of nature and engineering for absolute greed, the consequences are nothing short of a horror movie. We all know about the Titanic. We know how a colossal iceberg ripped through the world's greatest ship and sent it into the freezing abyss. But exactly 3 years after the Titanic sank, a tragedy unfolded right at an American dock that was arguably more terrifying, more agonizing, and far more sinister. You see, the Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. People had time to think, time to pray, and a small window to run. But the ship you are going to hear about today took only 72 seconds to capsize and swallow thousands of lives, just over 1 single minute. What makes this truly disturbing is that this vessel didn't sink in the deep ocean. It wasn't struck by a rogue wave, a fierce storm, or a jagged rock. It was sitting a mere 20 feet away from the concrete dock. The water was so shallow that if an adult stood up straight, their head would be comfortably above the surface. Yet, 844 people perished. This is the story of the SS Eastland, remembered in the dark corners of history as the Ship of Death. This isn't just an accident, it is a chilling tale of corporate greed, bureaucratic negligence, and a fatal stroke of bad luck that silenced hundreds of families forever. So brace yourselves because we are about to reopen one of history's darkest, most forgotten chapters. Our story begins not on that fateful day, but back in 1903 when the Michigan Steamship Company decided to build a flagship vessel. Their dream was to create a technological marvel, the fastest, sleekest, most aesthetically beautiful ship on the Great Lakes. They called it the SS Eastland. When it emerged from the shipyard, it was stunning. A massive white steel hull, 2 towering smokestacks, and high-end luxury flowing through every deck. They crowned it the Queen of the Lakes. But buried beneath this majestic exterior lay a catastrophic engineering flaw that the designers willfully ignored. The Eastland was built entirely for speed. To make it cut through water faster, it was designed to be narrow and exceptionally long. But this created a fatal problem. It was severely top-heavy. Its draft, the section of the ship that sits safely below the waterline, was far too shallow. In layman's terms, this massive vessel operated like a plastic rubber duck on the water. A sharp tilt or a sudden shift in weight could instantly flip it over. From day one, the ship was plagued by anomalies. During its maiden launch, it rocked so violently that passengers panicked. The crew quietly began calling it the cranky ship. It never sailed completely straight. It always listed slightly to one side. There were multiple instances where passengers would rush to one side of the deck to look at a passing landmark, causing the ship to tip dangerously close to the water. But every single time, luck was on their side. The owners knew the ship was unstable, but the insatiable desire for ticket profits blinded them completely. Then came April 1912. The Titanic sank, sending shockwaves through the global maritime industry. The investigation revealed that the primary reason for the massive loss of life was a severe shortage of lifeboats. In a frantic response, the United States government passed a sweeping new regulation in 1915 called the Seamen's Act. This law mandated that every single commercial ship must carry enough lifeboats and life rafts to accommodate every single passenger on board. On paper, this sounds like a brilliant life-saving decision. But for the chronically unstable SS Eastland, this exact safety law became its literal death warrant. The Eastland was already top-heavy. To comply with the new federal law and avoid losing their operating license, the management made a disastrous decision. They loaded 11 massive heavy steel lifeboats and 37 industrial life rafts onto the highest, topmost deck of the ship. Imagine a balance scale that is already completely unstable and you suddenly stack tons of dead weight onto the very top of it. This wasn't safety, it was involuntary suicide. The ship's veteran captain, Harry Pedersen, and chief engineer, Joseph Eriksson, knew this was a ticking time bomb. They raised urgent warnings. But upper management gave them an ultimatum. Follow the law, or the license gets revoked. And just like that, a rule designed to save lives increased the danger tenfold. We move to the ominous date of July 24, 1915, in the heart of Chicago. The morning sky was overcast with a light drizzle falling over the Chicago River, but the atmosphere on the docks was electric. This was the biggest day of the year for the employees of the Western Electric Company. The corporation had organized a massive, lavish summer picnic for its factory workers across Lake Michigan at a beautiful park in Indiana. Tickets were just 75 cents, and children got in completely free. For working-class families of that era, an excursion like this was a rare luxury. Everyone wore their absolute best clothes. The men were in heavy woolen suits and polished boots. The women wore elegant, multi-layered long gowns and elaborate hats, and the children sprinted around in fresh frocks. By 6:30 a.m., thousands of people began streaming onto the Eastland. The crowd was suffocatingly dense. Officially, the ship's maximum capacity was 2,500 people, and the company had sold every single ticket. As the massive crowd boarded, the ship's equilibrium instantly began to fail. It swayed back and forth, listing left and right. Down in the claustrophobic heat of the engine room, Chief Engineer Erickson was sweating profusely. He was frantically filling and emptying the ballast tanks, a system used to balance the ship's center of gravity with water weight. But the Eastland's ballast system was severely outdated. Pumping water in and out took an eternity. By 7:10 a.m., the ship was packed to the absolute brim with 2,572 passengers and over 70 crew members. People crowded the upper decks, waving to relatives on the wooden pier. A live band was playing upbeat music. Then, the ship took a sudden, hard tilt to the port side, away from the dock. This wasn't a standard sway. It was deep. The crew started screaming at the crowd to move to the starboard side to balance the weight, but the music was too loud, the chatter too dense. Nobody heard them. In the engine room, Erickson desperately ordered ballast tanks 2 and 3 to be flooded. The ship refused to right itself. By 7:20 a.m., things grew deeply unsettling. The tilt was so severe that heavy wooden furniture and luggage began sliding across the deck. Some passengers laughed, thinking it was part of the thrill, but seasoned sailors on the dock broke into a cold sweat. For the people trapped inside the lower enclosed decks, the view out the windows was no longer the gray Chicago skyline. It was just murky river water rising rapidly, yet nobody panicked. They were securely tied to the dock. The solid land was literally feet away. They assumed nothing bad could possibly happen. At exactly 7:28 a.m., a horrifying, thunderous screech echoed through the hull. It was the sound of massive refrigerators, heavy wooden piano units, and industrial kitchen equipment ripping free from their mounts and crashing violently into the portside walls. With its center of gravity completely destroyed, the SS Eastland didn't tip slowly. It rolled over in one sudden, catastrophic lurch. The people standing on the open upper decks were violently launched through the air, sliding across the smooth wood, smashing into the iron railings, and plummeting directly into the polluted, freezing river water. Imagine the sheer terror. Thousands of human beings sliding together in a massive wave, crushing one another. Those trapped against the railings were shoved deep underwater as hundreds of bodies piled directly on top of them. But the real unadulterated nightmare was unfolding inside the belly of the ship. The lower enclosed decks were packed with hundreds of women and children who had gone inside to escape the morning drizzle. When the ship capsized, the heavy furniture, massive tables, and oak chairs turned into lethal projectiles, raining down and crushing people instantly. And then came the water. The filthy, oil-slicked, suffocating water of the Chicago River surged through the open port-side windows and doors with the force of a flash flood. The people trapped inside didn't even have the time to process what was happening, let alone scream. The electrical grid instantly blew out, plunging the interior into pitch-black darkness. In a single moment, joyful laughter was replaced by the terrifying sound of rushing water and suffocating groans. On the pier, onlookers watched in absolute horror as a massive 33,000-ton steel monster simply rolled onto its side like a dead whale. It happened so fast that people who were waving goodbye to their families still had their hands frozen in midair. The giant iron beast lay flat in the water, and inside its steel hull, hundreds of souls were suffocating to death. And the most haunting part? They were only 20 feet away from safety. Within seconds, the Chicago River turned into a chaotic scene of human desperation. The surface of the water was a thrashing mass of people who had been thrown from the top deck. They were fighting to stay afloat, but the fashion of the 1915 era was a deadly trap. The heavy woolen suits and multi-layered thick Victorian dresses acted like sponges. The moment they absorbed the river water, they weighed a ton, acting like anchors dragging the helpless victims down into the mud. Mothers desperately held their infants above the waterline, but the panic was absolute. In a brutal display of the primal survival instinct, people began climbing over one another to reach the dock. It was a literal human bridge of bodies where the living inadvertently drowned the dying just to take one more breath of air. Bystanders on the shore and workers from nearby vessels rushed into action. They began hurling wooden crates, ropes, planks, and ladders into the water. A nearby ship named the Kenosha pulled right up against the exposed hull of the overturned Eastland, allowing a few lucky survivors to scramble onto its deck. But below the surface, the interior of the ship had turned into a floating tomb. The ship was lying flat on its side. The starboard cabins were exposed to the air, but the entire port side was fully submerged. Inside, the layout was completely inverted. Staircases were now horizontal walls, and walls were ceilings. Heavy debris blocked the main exit corridors. In the pitch blackness, people were treading water, desperately searching for an air pocket. A little girl named Helen was found hours later, floating miraculously in a tiny pocket of air trapped against a ceiling. She was completely silent, surrounded in the darkness by the lifeless bodies of her entire family. When first responders scrambled onto the exposed side of the hull, they froze. They could distinctly hear a frantic, hollow rhythmic tapping coming from inside the steel plates. People were alive inside, trapped in air pockets. Rescuers brought out industrial torches and gas cutters to slice holes through the thick steel hull. But it was a double-edged sword. The heat from the torches superheated the interior air, dropping molten sparks directly onto the victims trapped just inches below the metal. When they successfully breached the first hole, the stench in the site made hardened emergency workers violently ill. They began pulling out bodies, some breathing, but most completely blue and lifeless. A local man named Reggie Bowles, who became known to history as the Human Frogman, risked his life repeatedly. Without any modern diving gear, he dove into the dark, toxic, debris-filled interior of the sunken ship over and over again. Single-handedly, Bowles pulled out more than 40 bodies. He later recounted that the scenes underwater would haunt his psyche until the day he died. He described finding mothers underwater, still frozen in death, tightly clutching their children to their chests in a final, futile act of protection. By afternoon, all hope of finding survivors vanished. The rescue mission turned into a massive recovery operation. The sheer volume of casualties completely overwhelmed Chicago's morgues. The city literally ran out of coffins. Authorities had to requisition the massive 2nd Regiment Armory warehouse and convert it into a giant makeshift morgue. Row after row of hundreds of white sheets covered the cold floor. Thousands of citizens lined up outside in a silent, agonizing queue, walking down the aisles of the warehouse to identify the bodies of their spouses, siblings, and children. The silence in the room was shattered only by sudden, agonizing shrieks of recognition. Entire bloodlines were wiped out in those 72 seconds. 22 separate families were completely erased from existence. Parents and every single one of their children perished together. The final death toll stopped at 844 people. To put that into perspective, the Eastland claimed more passenger lives than the Titanic did, excluding the Titanic's crew. And worst of all, over 70% of the victims were under the age of 25. An entire generation of working-class youth vanished in a minute. The public outcry was furious. The city demanded blood. An official investigation was launched, and Captain Peterson and Chief Engineer Erickson were arrested. But as the Maritime trial unfolded, the truth revealed a sickening web of systemic failure. This wasn't the fault of one man. It was a chain of institutional failure. The owners prioritized maximum capacity over safety. The government blindly forced a lifeboat law without calculating structural physics, and the ship itself was fundamentally defective from the day it was drawn on paper. But do you want to know the most infuriating part of this entire tragedy? Not a single person went to prison. The legal battles dragged on for over 2 decades. Wealthy corporate executives and powerful shipping conglomerates used high-priced lawyers, exploiting every legal loophole to completely shield themselves from criminal liability. The families of the victims received next to nothing in compensation. The value of a human life was mathematically reduced to a few measly dollars. The SS Eastland was eventually raised from the riverbed, thoroughly drained and refurbished. The U.S. Navy purchased it, stripped its luxurious upper decks, and rebranded it as a gunboat called the USS Wilmette. But sailors are a superstitious lot, and the men assigned to the vessel claimed the ship was deeply cursed. Multiple crewmen reported hearing the distinct, hollow sound of children crying and laughing echoing from the empty machinery spaces during the midnight watch. Others claimed to see apparitions of women dressed in early 20th century gowns walking across the deck, only to dissolve into the mist when approached. The haunting reports extended to the shore as well. The 2nd Regiment Armory, where the 844 bodies were laid out, later became the site of Oprah Winfrey's famous Harpo Studios. For decades, security guards and late-night production staff reported heavy doors slamming on their own, unexplained cold spots, and the frequent sighting of a phantom known as the Gray Lady weeping in the corridors. It was as if the souls of July 1915 could never find peace because they were completely denied justice.